Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning if you are in the West Coast, and welcome to the Swiss Re Corporate Solutions webinar, Climate Change and Parametric Protection in Latin America. For the very first time, we are running this webinar in 3 languages. Our original track will be in English, but if you prefer to listen this webinar into Portuguese or Spanish, please select the language on the glove icon on the bottom menu of your screen, the one we said interpretation, and please choose the language of your preference, Spanish or Portuguese. We have set some time to answers and questions at the end of the hour, but I encourage you submit your questions any time during the webinar in any language. Do you feel more comfortable, Spanish, Portuguese, or English? Well, with us today, we have my colleagues Martin Hotz, Head Parametric NatCat for Swiss Re Corporate Solutions. Martin oversees the pricing and structuring of all parametric property NatCat covers, and he will talk about climate change and its potential effects on today's risk landscape. Ruben Hofliger, who is the head parametric NatCat, who is the head of public sector solutions in Latin America. Ruben leads the team dedicated to helping government entities strengthen their resilience strategies in Latin America. And Andrea Baer, the head innovative risk solutions for Latin America. Andrea's team works with our clients and brokers to transfer risk not always covered by traditional insurance. So on behalf of my colleagues, welcome to everybody. And before we start, I want to ask some questions for break the ice. Please help us with your answers. There is no right or wrong answers, and please type your answers via the chat function. So the first one is, which year has had the most insured NatCat losses since 1970? Please, your answer, which one do you think has had been the most affected year by losses? Next one. Why do you think the public sector bears a larger portion of the total economy loss after a catastrophe? There is no right or wrong answer. What do you think about the public sector bears here? And last but not least, can parametric solutions replace traditional insurance to close the protection gap? What do you think about this? No worries. My colleagues are going to explain deeply through the webinar. So now being 5 minutes past the hour, let's start. And thank you for your responses. Pass the word to Martin.
Many thanks, Sarah, and welcome from my side also. Pleased to see so many of you expressing interest in this webinar. And what I would like to show you on the first slide is a chart that many of you may have seen before. It is a chart that we at Swiss Re update annually as part of our Sigma publications. And what the bar chart is showing are global natural catastrophe losses paid for by the insurance industry split into so-called primary perils, such as earthquakes or hurricanes, in light green, secondary effects of primary perils, such as storm surge or tsunami, in light blue, and independent secondary perils, such as severe convective storms, hailstorms, or wildfires, in dark blue. The zigzagging line hovering around the 50% mark shows the share of these secondary perils, the hailstorms, the wildfires, as part of total insured natural catastrophe losses. So you see those secondary perils, they can be very relevant in aggregate, and also there is quite some volatility on a year-on-year basis. While 2020 will forever be remembered by the ongoing COVID crisis, against the backdrop of the disruption caused by the pandemic, millions of people also experienced severe weather events. And in 2020, the global insurance industry covered 81 billion in US dollars in terms of natural catastrophe losses globally. That is the fifth costliest natural catastrophe loss year to the insurance industry, and also above the 10-year average. And now, to answer Sarah's leading question earlier, the costliest natural catastrophe loss year to the insurance industry was in fact 2017, with hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, which you will all certainly remember. What's quite obvious on this chart is that insured losses have been rising in the long term, and we expect this to continue. Factors are population growth on one side, increasing property values, particularly in exposed areas such as in low-lying areas close to the coast, as well as the effects of climate change. As we can see on the next slide, what was standing out in 2020 as far as natural catastrophe activity goes, obviously was the very active North Atlantic hurricane season, which broke numerous records. Some of these you have summarized here on the screen, and what was driving this record active hurricane season was, to a large degree, record warm ocean temperatures, as more than 90% of the extra heat that is trapped by climate change is absorbed by the oceans. That means that there is a lot of energy hurricanes can tap into, and they can use this fuel to intensify, and that means that at Swiss Re, we think it is likely and it's possible that we will see hurricane seasons as we've seen them in 2020 more often going forward. However, it does not mean that going forward, and that includes 2021, every year will be as active as 2020. We will continue to see a lot of variability from one year to the other, and the ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which we know with the El Nino and La Nina extremes, has also a high impact on hurricane frequency and intensity, for example. And that means that while the long-term trend might point towards an increased number of very intense storms, the variability from one year to the other will be very large. Despite the large number of storms that were observed in 2020, insurance industry losses, in fact, could have been higher, but in particular in the US, most hurricanes and named storms did not impact densely populated areas. This was down to luck, and there is no reason why future storms will not strike areas of high economic wealth. And it was certainly no luck for those communities in Central America in the path of last year's tropical storms and hurricanes, but which were without reinsurance or insurance, had no recourse to compensation. So on the next slide, let's zoom into 3 Central American countries impacted by hurricanes. And one was Mexico, where 3 named storms made landfall in the state of Quintana Roo within just 25 days. All 3 storms made landfall relatively late in the hurricane season, in October, and as the season has already been extremely busy by then, only for the second time in history, the storms were given names of Greek letters. And that's because the hurricane name list, which is defined ahead of a hurricane season, only includes 21 names, and in 2020, the name storm list was already depleted, and the Greek letters had to be used again for the second time after 2005. Now, this system, some decades ago, people thought of that this would be sufficient to have 21 named storms on the list, and that this would be sufficient for a season. But now, for the second time, it actually turned out to be insufficient. So the storms making landfall in Mexico were given the names of Gamma, Delta, and Zeta. And you see for Delta, for example, it reached a record in terms of how fast it intensified from a tropical depression to a Cat 4 hurricane. It only took that storm 36 hours to achieve that, which is again a feature that we see very rapidly intensifying hurricanes, and that is made possible by a lot of heat stored in the oceans. Now, the Greek letter names, unless you're Greek, they may not be that easy to remember for most of us, and some even sound very similar, which can create confusion, which isn't ideal when it comes to alerting the public. And that is why earlier this year, actually, the World Meteorological Organization announced that going forward, it will no longer use those Greek letters. And we also see this as an acknowledgement that very active hurricane seasons are expected to happen more frequently in the future, hence a new naming scheme that is more robust and also works well in very active seasons had to come up with. On the next slide, we see 2 further countries that were very hard hit last year. Colombia, where the island of Providencia was severely impacted by Hurricane Iota, which at the highest scale of the hurricane intensity scale as a Category 5 hurricane passed within only a few miles. And then later, Iota went on to make landfall in Nicaragua within only 10 miles from where less than 2 weeks before Hurricane Eta also made landfall. So you clearly see that when it comes to weather extremes, something as impossible doesn't exist, because who would have assumed at the same time last year that within 2 weeks, 2 such strong hurricanes could make landfall in virtually the same place. And as we heard, a warmer atmosphere can hold more energy, which is why it's widely accepted that not only hurricanes find more energy, but also extreme precipitation events will go up. And however, not all places will be impacted equally. And now, in a fresh attempt to quantify the impact of climate change, Swiss Re published a new study last month. And on the next slide, we see the name of that study. It was called The Economics of Climate Change: No Action, Not an Option. And one of the key statements is that the world stands to lose 10% of total economic value over the next 30 years if climate change is not tackled and it's not, no serious action is being taken. The study focused on 48 countries, which represent 90% of the world economy. 7 of these countries are from Latin America, and core to the study is a newly developed climate economics index, which is an index used to stress test how climate risks can impact economies at a national level. So let's take a look at that in practice on the next slide, where you see a ranking of those countries studied. There is also a website to which we can provide you the link, where you can use an interactive tool which summarizes the index, where for each country the study assessed how climate change impacts the gross domestic product, how it impacts extreme weather risk, and also how it impacts, or how a country's adaptive capacity to climate change is. And the total index score is then based on these 3 main categories. And on the website, one can also drill into an individual country. So let's look at Brazil as an example, which we see illustrated on the next slide, where the study finds that as global temperatures increase, Brazil is deemed to be prone to experience hotter and drier conditions, and that during summer days, excessive heat waves can suppress crop yields, induce human health-related mortality and disease, and that under this scenario, also tourism would be severely impacted. The overall conclusion of this latest Swiss Re Group report is that the impacts of climate change can be lessened if decisive action is taken to meet the targets set out in the Paris Agreement. This is what we see on the right side of this slide, actually, where under different scenarios where more decisive action is taken, global warming can be slowed down, and that this means climate stress reduces, resulting in significant savings. We at Swiss Re are of the view that insurers and reinsurance play a key role in providing not only risk transfer capacity, but also share risk knowledge and use their understanding of risk to help households, to help companies and societies mitigate and adapt to climate change. And with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague Rubem, who will now present us innovative solutions specifically for the public sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Good afternoon, everyone. In my case, I'm going to talk a bit about the importance of working with governments to make the world more resilient, and the need to understand their challenges and the role that risk transfer solutions can play on helping the public sector. If we go to the next one, please. So here we can see the public sector solutions team within Swiss Re. It's important to say that this was the first team that was created and fully dedicated to the public sector in the insurance reinsurance industry. As you can see, we have a team spread across the globe with colleagues also on the origination side, but also on developing and structuring deals. Our mandate is really to help governments to understand the risks they bear, to understand the exposure they have, and to help them developing risk transfers, tailor-made risk transfer solutions, and help them alleviate the burden on their balance sheets. We have bound different transactions across the globe, and as being a global team, we also help the Swiss Re Group business units to grow in the public sector space. If we go to the next one, please. So here, building a bit on Martin's comments on the total insured losses, one of the very relevant things to highlight is not only the insured losses have grown significantly over the years, but also the total economic losses, meaning the protection gap has increased significantly over the years, which is the difference between the total economic losses and the insured losses. We, as Martin mentioned, we have a significant growth on the economies, on the population, on urban cities, and insurance is not really accompanying the growth of the economic activity. And this is what is happening, is that the gap is widening. So as you can see here, 65% of the economic losses caused by natural catastrophes over the past decade were uninsured. And going back to the question around why the public sector bears a larger portion of the total economic losses, the main reason is because there are a lot of concepts that the government needs, are responsible, is under their scope beyond their public assets. So the government has a social responsibility towards the low-income population, the affected population. They need not only to, after a natural disaster, not only to take care of their own assets, buildings, public infrastructure, but they also need to help the affected population, the emergency response costs. They need to provide food, shelter, aid supplies, medicines. They need to work on debris removal, heavy machinery, and everything that is needed for the early recovery and the reconstruction. And the goal of the government is always to try to get the economy back to normal as soon as possible, because public budgets get under twofold strain, which means they have to assume higher costs of everything that is under their responsibility, including helping the affected population, the population of low income that, for example, they don't have access to financial instruments, no access to insurance, but if they lose their home, they simply cannot get back to normal without the government support. Or that population on the rural areas, the farmers that have only a few crops for their self-sustenance, if they don't get support from the government after they lost their crops, they can get back to normal. And if you look at the higher costs plus the lower revenues, that's why we have a twofold strain on public budgets. The pressure is the double of the impact, because the affected areas, they have lower tax revenues, they have lower tourism, for example, lower export revenues, and that's why government has to spend more money with less income within the affected, impacted areas. That's why it's so important for governments to have proper disaster risk management strategies, including insurance coverages, and the goal of getting back to normal and reactivating the economy as soon as possible. Otherwise, what happens when that's not properly assessed is that governments need to do either budget reallocation and shift money or resources from social development, public infrastructure, new buildings, new infrastructure, and reallocate it to the affected areas. They need sometimes to increase taxes or create new taxes to come up with the expenditure, or in some cases also to raise additional debt and committing and compromising future generations. If we go to the next one, please. Here we can see a few examples of international well-recognized institutions about the importance for governments to have insurance. Why is it important for governments to have insurance, but also the positive impact that it can have on their sovereign credit rating? Mainly because if the government is well protected, they have what we call it enhances their fiscal and financial resilience. And if a government has financial resilience, that impacts positively to their credit risk. And the credit risk is extremely important for governments, mainly because if you lose your sovereign credit rating after a major event, on top of all the economic losses and the costs to the emergency costs, early recovery and reconstruction, automatically your current debt will be more expensive, and it's going to be much more expensive and difficult to raise additional debt if you lost your credit rating. So that's why it's so important also for governments to be aware of the risks they bear, be aware of the impact that a natural disaster can have on their fiscal resilience, and be prepared and have solutions to help them cope with that situation. So that's what we do in public sector solutions. We help governments understand that and provide tailor-made solutions to fit their needs. Go to the next one, please. This is just a few distinctive advantages for the public sector to have insurance. If we look, for example, very relevant, speedy delivery, fast payouts that we can achieve with parametric solutions. We'll get into that later during the presentation, and also Andrea will explain in detail how parametric solutions work, but it's one of the key topics, having quick cash payout, money relief, money being injected to reactivate the economy. We discussed that already, and this is extremely relevant for governments in order to be able to get things back to normal as soon as possible. No payback obligation in contrast to loans. We've seen many governments try to compare credit rates with premium, which is not the case. In the case of the contingency credit loans and some other types of loans, this is different from insurance. You can't find a adequate rate to compare them, because in the case of insurance, you don't have a payback obligation. On loans, at the end, you will need to pay back whatever money is being provided at the moment. So this is also important for governments to realize. And as we mentioned already, the reduction of contingent liabilities, because if you have an adequate insurance scheme or strategy within your country, that can also have a positive impact on your sovereign rating. Go to the next one, please. So parametric insurance as an innovative risk transfer tool for the public sector. Why is this relevant for the public sector? Because once again, looking at the government's social responsibility, all the intangible and insurable risks that the government needs to face. Remember, they not only have the mandate or to protect and cover their own assets, they also need to protect the population. And in this case, parametric solutions can provide with very fast payouts after an event occurs. Why? Because the parametric solutions relies on the measurement of a specific natural phenomenon or a predefined index, and it doesn't need to go out to the field to take a loss assessment of the damages in the field. It's just really measuring the probability of the occurrence and next type of event. And if the event surpasses the defined threshold, you get a payout. And the money can be used as needed according to the needs and priorities that the government has at the moment of the event. As you can see here, there's different types of natural perils like earthquake, hurricanes, excess, lack of rain, drought, flood, so many other types of perils that can be measured and can be used as a predefined trigger for a parametric solution for the government. As mentioned, the flexibility on the use of funds is also extremely relevant for governments, because they will need to use the money according to the priorities on the field. And also, once again, mentioning one of the reasons why this is also important or relevant, because there are many other types of uninsurable risks, like the emergency costs, the loss of revenues that is not easily able to be implemented through a traditional indemnity coverage. If we go to the next one, please. So here, just looping back on the importance and the challenges on why is insurance important for governments after a catastrophic event. We discussed it already. The governments face significant challenges after a massive event, and they need to have the financial strength to attend and return to normal as soon as possible. That's why we believe that parametric solutions can complement traditional insurance and provide a sufficient resources and need for the government to have this immediately liquidity that they need for the early recovery and pass on the emergency phase and get back to normal, so the economy can be reactivated, the population can get back to normal, the government will start once again getting revenues by tax, tourism coming back, and then that's a virtuous cycle of money flowing again through the economy. The next one, please. Just to conclude, this is the examples of some of the innovative public sector risk transfer solutions we have implemented across the globe and across the different lines of business. We can see here all kinds of risk transfer solutions coming from energy, property nat cat, agriculture, but also on different types of perils like hurricane, earthquake, flood, drought, energy shortfall. We can see also that we have different types of risk transfer formats. We have insurance, reinsurance solutions, we have cat bond solutions, we have derivatives. So this is kind of just to give you some examples, the Pacific Alliance cat bond, which was an earthquake cat bond that was issued in 2018, in which the four countries of the Pacific Alliance get together, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Peru, and they place their earthquake risks through the capital markets with the help of the World Bank, and they were covered against earthquakes for a period of 3 years. Another relevant example is the Uruguay energy shortfall cover, which it's a very innovative solution against drought and the probability of a decrease of the energy generation on a hydroelectric dam if the flow of the river and the rain is not enough to produce the energy. Normally Uruguay needs to go out to the international market to buy fossil fuels in order to generate the electricity they need. And when there's a drought in Uruguay, it's not only on the countries, it's a more regional event happening. And then not only they don't generate the expected power, but also they need to go out and buy fossil fuels in a much more expensive cost. That's why this energy shortfall coverage, it's providing a limit that provides a payment once there is a lack of rain according to a predefined index, and the price of the fossil fuels goes up to certain levels. There's also different risk transfer solutions or parametric solutions for the Caribbean, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility that covers the Caribbean islands against earthquakes, hurricanes, excessive rainfall, and also now covering utilities and some other types of solutions. Overall, this is a snapshot of the types of solutions that we have across the globe. I will encourage everyone that if you have a client, if you have a need, if you are a government client and you have a need, we can definitely help you find a solution, a tailor-made solution to fit your need. With that, I'll stop here and give the word to Andrea for the following presentation. Looking forward for your questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ruben. And a very warm welcome also from my side. We intend to structure parametric NatCat solutions to cover mainly uninsured and underinsured risks at the headquarters of our clients in Latin America or any subsidiary in Latin America, but also in the world, basically, right? Of where they have a subsidiary or there is any insurable interest. We cover any PD, any BI, any CBI, NDBI exposure, and any extra expense a client might have. Specifically in this current hard market situation, we see a lot of demand. That's mainly due to the higher self-insured retentions we see, the higher deductibles, sublimits, exclusions, and also a shortage of capacity. And as Martin outlined very nicely in the beginning, we have a lot of TC exposure tropical cyclone exposure in the Caribbean, in Mexico, in Central America. And last year, we surprisingly also saw that Colombia was impacted. So there's definitely a need for parametric NetCat solutions. 2.0, why do we call them 2.0? We would like to dive into our solutions, Storm and Quake, because they relate to advanced triggers. So that's why we call them 2.0. And those triggers really help our clients to reduce the risk that a client is affected, they have a loss, but the policy, the parametric insurance policy is not being triggered. Let's jump into our first solution, Storm. As the name says, it's related to tropical windstorm. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the Hurricane Saffir-Simpson hurricane category or maximum wind speeds, if we look at those triggers only, they don't really capture the localized impacts, right? So each storm, each hurricane is different, has different sizes, different intensities. What we really see is that losses are very much correlated to the wind speed observed at an insured location, or that can be an asset of a client or any insurable interest. We use RMSH Wind, which is an independent third-party provider, and they use technology driven by data coming from aircraft, satellite, local weather stations, and they put all of this data together. And what we receive is a wind footprint. And this wind footprint is a report about the reported wind speeds visualized as well across the entire area of concern. And with that, we don't not only look at one hurricane category type of trigger, but we really look at the localized impact of the entire hurricane. We have been using this technology in our marketing in the area in Latin America already since 2017. Let's look at an example of how that actually works. Next slide, please. So here we have Hurricane Maria, which impacted Puerto Rico in 2017. And we have here one location. It's close to the airport in San Juan. We have a payout structure pre-agreed where we start paying at 60 miles per hour, a 20% payout of a pre-agreed limit, in this example of 5 million. And the reported wind speeds were 103 miles per hour. And according to the pre-agreed payout structure and the limit, that policy would have paid 100%, equaling 5 million. Let's have a look at the next slide if we had more than one location, because that's really a beauty of this product, that we can allocate different limits to different locations. That allows us, for example, to emulate a deductible buy-down structure. So here we added 3 more locations, Bayamón, Ponce, and Mayagüez in Puerto Rico. And as you might well remember, TC Maria affected very heavily the greater San Juan area, but not so much the north and the western, the south and the western part of the island. And that's reflected here in the reported wind speeds of 71 and 79 miles per hour for Ponce and Mayagüez. And that in that structure, those locations would have received a payout of 40%. And overall, yeah, it's still a very, very nice payout for this sample client, and it very much illustrates that we have all the flexibility when it comes to more than one location allocating different limits, and we see the localized impact very well demonstrated here as well. I quickly would like to mention earthquake as well. If we go to the next slide, please. Because we have a lot of earthquake exposure in the region. It's not really related to climate change, but it's an important exposure we have. And if we go to the next slide, we can see here that the same thing, we talk about parametric 2.0 solutions where we use triggers which have a better correlation to the localized impact of a client and the insured location. So a simple magnitude trigger here, for example, faces the challenge that a moderate magnitude earthquake directly where the client is located with an epicenter in that area can cause the same loss than a very severe earthquake event happening far away from the location of interest. So we really believe the closer correlation of the direct or indirect financial loss is much better with a severity, earthquake severity based trigger, which can be PSA or MMI. For those solutions, we use USGS as an independent third-party provider. So if we go to the next slide, we see another example based on the earthquake 1976 in Guatemala, where we have one insured location. We use a PSA-based earthquake intensity payout structure, starting at 30% of G, paying 20%, and as the intensity increases, our payout in percent of the limit pre-agreed of 10 million in this example increases as well. So this example would have paid 80% of the pre-agreed limit of 10 million due to the PSA reported by USGS of 79%. So how would a multi-location example look like? We see that on the next slide. Here, Mexico, many of us might still remember the two earthquakes in Mexico, which occurred in 2017. Here we picked the city of Mexico and we identified two locations, one Coyoacán and the other one Santa Fe. So even within one city, the experienced MMI were different. So we see here that based on the payout structure starting at 6.0, going up to 8, with a payout starting at 30% and going slightly up 50, 70, 90, and 100. For that, if that were a policy, we would have paid 30 and 50% of the pre-agreed limit here, in this case of 20 million. And what we want to demonstrate here that even, Mexico City is a very big city, but the perceived intensities can be quite different as well. Not so different in that example, but there can be a difference. So let's have a look at how we can actually help our clients with these type of solutions on some real like success stories and application examples we have been working on ever since we started to work on parametric solutions. The first one is transmission and distribution lines. So for those type of assets, it's very difficult in the traditional marketplace to find coverages. Typically, they're excluded in traditional property policy insurance contracts. Many clients had severe losses during the last hurricanes in 2017, so it's even more difficult to find coverage. The coverages are still sublimited. The assets are geographically dispersed, so it's quite difficult also to model them. And what we have been taking are approaches where we take, for example, the population density or a zip code-based approach to model and simulate these type of assets and the network of those related assets. Another nice example, if we go to the next slide, please, is the tourism industry, very important for the Caribbean. In Mexico, we have a lot of hotels, vacation resort, amusement parks, a lot of beachfront hotel locations. Many carriers have very limited risk appetite for beachfront locations. We have a lot of exclusions of golf courses, tennis courts, outdoor goods, any loss of beach, landscaping. We have CBI exposure as well. If there is a close by airport and the airport is closed or damaged after a hurricane event, there is cancellation of bookings taking place. Many times we use our parametric solutions to fill in for deductibles or also to carve out, for example, windstorm exposure completely. And offer it on a parametric basis. The beauty is also, Martin mentioned that in the beginning, we have secondary perils or secondary related perils, such as storm surge, and we can also cover any of those related losses in a parametric insurance policy, as long as the trigger, which is the wind speed in this case, is being met and the policy pays out. A next example I would like to mention is financial institutions. There is a need for the default of loan payments after a severe event occurs, or for example, there is a grace period implemented by the government. There is no cover available for those type of exposures. The assets also are typically widely geographically dispersed. So it's quite difficult to model individual homeowners, right? So we also took approaches here. We took zip code and bank subsidiary based accumulations into account and modeled an approach where we took the limit of the outstanding loan amount into account and allocated it based on those zip code or subsidiary-based volumes of loan amounts, for example. If we go to the next slide, we also have looked into mining and line risk. This is very much specific for Chile and Peru, where we have a lot of those mining operations, and we face some severe business interruptions, CBI and NDBI exposure. Because these operations heavily depend on like a railway track or the ports to export the goods and the raw material to their clients. So these dependencies, they cause an issue, and also there is a lot of sublimits typically involved in these type of operations, such as like molten material, tailing dams, and so on and so forth. And with our parametric solution, we can cover and structure a broad coverage. The next two examples are related. So the first one is a very nice one because it's a very bespoke solution we offered in 2019 actually. Coral reefs and beaches, they are highly exposed to tropical cyclone events, and they're very, very important for the tourism industry. It's very complicated to elaborate and come up with a replacement cost evaluation. And also typically there is no indemnity cover available. So it has all sorts of issues, right, to come up or to insure these type of assets in an indemnity program. So what happened was we teamed up with the Nature Conservancy, and together with the client, there was a study being conducted to identify the cover area and the payout pattern, which defines the client's anticipated damages. And the structure, when it was placed, it was the very first one of its kind to cover actual natural assets such as coral reefs and beaches. And the last one I quickly would like to share, which is very much related to it. It's about historical heritage. We have a lot of pyramids. We have a lot of nice old churches and historical sites, basically all over Latin America. And here an example in Mexico, where we have sites highly exposed to earthquake. And yeah, if something happens, it's again important for the tourism industry to have some sort of payout after a severe hurricane occurs. Again, it's very complicated to elaborate the replacement cost of these type of sites and historical heritage. And the assets can be also geographically widely dispersed, which makes it also difficult. And yeah, the beauty of our products is that we can really use all structural flexibility to allocate certain limits, for example, which can be based on the seismic hazard associated with those sites. So overall, parametric insurance, does it really replace traditional indemnity insurance? It has a lot of benefits for sure, which will be a reason why they are more widely considered than ever before. The very broad coverage we typically offer, then the super fast payout, most of the time in less than 30 days. There is no loss adjustment involved, and we definitely offer them as a complement to traditional insurance to cover all the gaps we have seen Martin pointed out, and also Ruben in his presentation before. With that, I would like to stop and give some time for questions. So please feel free and submit your questions in the chat. It doesn't matter which language you use, feel free to ask your question. We will try to answer them right now and are at your disposal.
Andrea, if I may, just to complement the question that was answered by Martin, is related to these NatCat example payments are only triggered by the magnitude of the event, but not by the amount of the real damages, or when is this evaluated? I will just complement that normally when the design and the structure is being taken place, we try to find the adequate correlation between historical losses and the payout that is going to be set. This is what we call basis risk. We don't want to have either a positive basis risk, either a negative basis risk, meaning we don't want our solutions to pay when there is no losses, but to the contrary, we also don't want a major loss and no payment, or a payment below than expected. That's why it's important always to take a look at the historical losses for XY type of peril and try to correlate. And that's why we call this tailor-made solutions. It's tailor-made solutions because we need to work together with the client to fine-tune the product to decrease this basis risk.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, no, I fully agree. So you're answering the question of Isaac here, right? I just see that here. Yeah, definitely.
We have one more.
Yeah, Sarah, do you?
Yes, we do have a...
Yeah, for sure, Andrea, we have a couple of questions. Which is the cost of the parametric insurance in average?
Yeah, let me jump onto this. So that very much depends on the payout structure we set up for a client, right? And the geographic where we are working in, whether we cover earthquake, whether we cover windstorm. But in general, what we have seen over the last couple of years, we talk about a rate on line in percent rather than in per mil in comparison to indemnity insurance. So that's a little bit of a difference. And then also, yeah, it depends really on the exposure. An earthquake cover in Chile has a different price than if it were, I don't know, somewhere in Colombia, for example. So it depends on the exposure, and then the payout structure is another element. But I would say for windstorm, our radon lines, they start at around 5%, just to have some idea. And earthquake, very much depending on where we are, but the radon lines are probably more in the, let's say, 3% area.
If I may add to that, it really is a function of how exposed the area is to the respective phenomenon. And because certain places, if you think of maybe Puerto Rico for a hurricane, when you have to expect a hurricane every 5 to 10 years perhaps, and a stronger hurricane every 4 to 50 years, then this is what is driving the premium. I think the way we underwrite those policies, the margin is not higher than elsewhere, perhaps even the opposite, because there is no element of unexpected losses on either side. It's a very transparent policy, very transparent for both parties. When the event does occur, then the policy criteria is met and the payment can be made very quickly, and there is no need for any buffer, but following the exposure of the location, that has an impact on the price.
We have two more questions, Sarah, one on the chat and another one in the Q&A.
Yes. Yeah, the one said, so the parametric insurance are just designed for natural catastrophes. Additionally, nowadays the solutions are expensive. Do you think that if more clients acquire this kind of solutions, the prices of these solutions will be more accessible?
I'm happy to take it again. As I was typing to another question, my response, I think on the starting on the pricing, I think it's really a matter of the exposure level of a certain location, and when the exposure is high, then it also would not be fair trying to then design a policy which seems cheap on the outside, but the value on the inside is just not there, because it only provides covers for situations which are truly unrealistic to achieve, right? Sort of a category 6 hurricane, almost. And parametric insurance is not limited to applications in parametric natural catastrophe. I think it's widely used in that space, covering weather phenomena more broadly, precipitation-based, hours of sunshine for power production, etc. But it can really go beyond weather-related parameters, and we have worked on indices related to the tourism industry, for example, hotel occupation rates, travel-related statistics for clients in the hospitality industry. So when the parameter or the index value can be measured accurately, reported independently, and the index is a good proxy for the loss that it sustained, then it qualifies for a parametric policy.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, we have a couple of questions, but someone here said, have you collaborated with companies using Internet of Things or sensor technologies to support your parametric policies?
Yes, we have. And what is always important is that the technology is robust and does not fail, in particular during the extreme conditions that one actually wants to have covered via such a risk transfer, and that also in the remote case that the technology does fail, that there is also a good backup mechanism in place. But clearly the rise of a greater number of reliable high-resolution data networks is one of the reasons why we see parametric solutions becoming increasingly popular.
Okay, perfect. Now the time is over, so that's all that we have for today. Thank you for being a great audience. We really appreciate your attention, your participation, and questions. This recording will be available in the coming days in case of you want to listen it again or share with any of your contacts. In the meantime, please reach out to me or any of today's presenters with your questions. We are trying to answer all of the questions that we have in the chat. We will be happy to continue discuss and having this conversation with you. And thanks again, and hope to speak with you soon. Please enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.